Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm Dan Oppenheimer, off-brand Terry Gross of the contemporary American intellectual scene. My guest on the show today is Brady Dale, crypto reporter for Axios News and author of the 2023 biography of Sam Bankman-Fried, SBF, How the FTX Bankruptcy Unwound Crypto's Very Bad Good Guy. Our topic for our conversation, as you may have guessed, is crypto. And more broadly, what are the ideologies and ideas swirling around the technology of cryptocurrency? I just re-listened to the conversation, and although I didn't quite intend it this way when I invited Brady on the podcast, I think it ended up being a really good, smart, but not too technical primer on crypto in general. I kind of used Brady, in a sense, to answer all my questions about what crypto is and to sort of test out my preconceptions and what I thought were my insights. We talked about who some of the key players are, what the utopian aspirations around crypto were, whether any of them survive to the present, and kind of what the future of crypto and policy and ideas around crypto is likely to be. So Brady obviously knows what he's talking about, having covered the industry almost since its beginnings, but I was more impressed than I expected to be with myself, with my own capacity to ask intelligent questions, given that it's not remotely an area of expertise for me. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. One thing I want to get to before we get to that is, and I'll send out a separate post about this as well, but I would like to do a podcast experiment, the first of its kind on my show, and I need your help with it. I want to do an episode of the pod in which I hear from you or talk to you about the ideal succession plan for Fresh Air, for NPR's Fresh Air with Terry Gross. So Terry seems to me to be in the valedictory phase of her career. She added a co-host a year or two ago, Tanya Mosley. She's been giving more interviews to other journalists about herself, so she's been the interview subject. She mentioned recently in one of her interviews that her husband died not long ago, and one just gets the sense, listening to her, that she's kind of getting ready to retire. So for the sake of argument, let's imagine that she is going to retire in the next year or two or three, and then the question is who should replace her, and what is the rationale for different suggestions for her replacement. In an ideal world, who should it be if it could be anyone? But also pragmatically, who will it be? Who might it realistically be if Mosley doesn't end up inheriting the chair? What are some real left field notions and why? What makes that person you're suggesting unique, compelling, charismatic? What was so special about Terry that makes her so hard to imagine replacing? Who are the most Terry-like possible replacements? And then what's a totally other direction that we could go in, that NPR could go in, where it would kind of capture some of the magic, but at a very different frequency? So if you would like to participate, you have a few different options, all of which involve emailing me at djopps@gmail.com, djops@gmail.com. So here are the options that occur to me, but you can suggest another one. One is that we can record a quick shot interview with me, like 5 to 10 minutes, to discuss your idea, and then I can stitch some of those together into a podcast. Another is that you can just write me a few sentences or a few hundred words on your proposed toast, or honestly as many words as you want to write, and I can either kind of read some of those on the podcast, or maybe it can be part of a separate or connected prose post. You're also welcome to record a voice memo or a short video of yourself saying what you want, and I can drop it in some form. Or if you have some other idea, I'm open to it. So anyway, hopefully I'll get enough of these to combine them together into a really cool podcast. Deadline in general, September 10th. But if you'd like to record a short interview with me, that requires a little bit more coordination. So please let me know sooner rather than later so we can find a time to do that. Again, my email is djopps@gmail.com. So hopefully we can get that done. I think that'll be fun. And now on to the conversation with Brady Dale. Peace. Brady, welcome to Eminent Americans. You are hereby anointed an eminent American by virtue of the power vested in me by the ghost of Sam Bankman-Fried. You are Brady Dale, one of the world's first and preeminent crypto reporters. Tell me how you got into reporting on crypto in the first place, kind of when and how and where.
Sure. So I'm a second career person. I have no training as a journalist at all, which, may or may not be evident to my readers. I was in nonprofit do-gooder activist-y life for a really long time. Always meant to be a writer, but had this dumb idea, and I really was a dumb idea for young people listening, don't do this, that I needed to do something else first. Maybe that made sense 100 years ago, but in the modern world, just go straight out the thing. But I had this idea that I should do something else first. So I was in lefty activism for a long time. And as I started to get the sense that I was ready to leave that, I started poking around. Back then I still kind of was a do-gooder at heart. And so I didn't want to do anything bad. And this was like in the late 2000s, I started to think about this. And at that point, people were still pretty positive about tech. You know, tech was still pretty benign. And so I started hanging out in a bunch of meetups, tech meetups in Philadelphia. That's where I was at the time. And I was just like, well, maybe I could be in tech. You know, tech's all right. That wouldn't do any harm. And I started really getting interested in how tech people think about things, the idea about embracing failure and pivoting fast and all. And then I was saving up some money and I quit my job and I had like about enough money to last for a year in Philadelphia and was just trying things. You know, I had a podcast at the time. I was doing a webcomic, but I had some friends who were writers and by then had small editorial positions. And they knew that I was doing this. And they were like, well, do you want to write for me for $50 every now and then? And I was like, okay. And that just kind of evolved into me actually becoming a full-time journalist. You know, I guess I did an okay job at a certain amount of that. And so I got a job at the New York Observer where I sat across from one of your past guests, Ross Barkan. I was covering tech in general. So I thought I was going to work in tech and then I became a tech reporter.
Can I ask you, I'm kind of curious about your left-wing do-gooder background. So what were your jobs in that space?
My first job is I worked for this place called the Interfaith Alliance, which was sort of a counter to like the Christian Coalition. Then I thought I wanted to be like a real grassroots organizer. So I worked very briefly for this organization called DART, which I'm sure you've never heard of, but they were in the Saul Alinsky tradition of organizing, if that means anything. That didn't really work out. Then I moved to UW-Madison and I was the on-staff campus organizer for the student government, which is a weird thing that they had in Madison back in the day. So I was teaching students how to cause trouble for the university. That's really was my job.
Weird.
Yeah. So I did that for a few years. I was really successful at that. Who cares? But I was. I mean, it didn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but I was a great campus organizer. And then I wanted to get out of there. So I moved to Philadelphia. I worked for Acorn for a little while, and that was a very busy period. But they just, that was a really rough place to work. I mean, they just pay you so little and work you so hard. I got a lot done, but I just couldn't take it. And so I left there and worked for a slightly chiller version of the same thing in Philadelphia called the Philadelphia Unemployment Project. We had a couple successes there. We got the minimum wage increase in the state of PA. That was kind of our big success. And that helped to enable Obama not much longer to, raise minimum wage for the whole country. Then I worked for Clean Water Action for 4 years, which my political interest started with environmentalism, actually. I just had never done it before then. So that was my longest stint at a lefty organization. Claim to fame there is I was early in fighting fracking. I don't know how folks feel about fracking, but if you don't like it, I was super early in fighting it. I have complex feelings about it now, but it was in that time that I was just like, this is enough of this. I never want to hold a sign above my head again. I never want to call someone and annoy them on the phone about, you should quit watching TV and care about some random issue because some jerk's calling you. I didn't want to do that anymore. So I stopped and I'll never go back. And I started working on other things and now I'm a reporter.
Well, I will not push you to go deep into that traumatic torture path further, but I was going to say two things. One is we have kind of interesting overlaps just in a sort of geographical sense. My younger brother was undergrad at University of Wisconsin in Madison. I wonder if he was there. He may have been there kind of overlapping with you. So I know that area a little bit. I also have pretty deep roots in Philadelphia. My mom is from there. We spent a lot of time there when I was growing up. But I think the other thing I was going to say that is just context for this conversation, which is the sort of utopian politics or ideas that are the sort of intellectual foundation of the crypto world, or at least, aspire to be. It may be that crypto at this point is kind of detached from that and is basically just a bunch of capitalists and scammers and operators. But at least in its early years, there was a real sort of organic connection to some fairly utopian ideas. So you coming from a world of left-wing utopian ideas is relevant in that sense,
yeah.
I think.
One other aside I want to make about my background, just from your early episodes I've listened to, you often talk this up. I think I'm your first, truly, really lower middle class guest, maybe. My mom was a teacher. I never met my dad. My grandfather was a small business owner, very, real estate.
And where was this?
All here in Southeast Kansas, man. Just as unglamorous as it gets.
Real America. Are you telling me that you're my first real American guest? Is that what
I'm not saying real American, but no ties to the imminent world. I didn't really have, I don't have any, no one in my family was working at a fancy university or anything like that. In fact, that was one of the real struggles for me around high school years. Is I knew I wanted to go to a fancy school just because that seemed like helpful in some way. I'm not sure it was. I mean, I did, but I'm not sure it really did help me that much. But that was, I wanted to get out of town, and that was my path.
Let's now go back to you starting to report on crypto, which it sounds like, well, you started to report on tech, right? So you connected with some people in Philadelphia who were in the tech world because you're like, I don't know, I'm done with this activist nonprofit life. Maybe a good place to transition to is tech. You start meeting with these people, you start writing about it. So it's not immediately, and I don't even know the chronology. So when is this? Is early 2010s, late 2000s? What year are we talking about?
I moved to New York, and I always forget. I think I moved in 2013. It might have been 2014. My first technically full-time job was at the Observer, but like I kind of was full-time at this other place before. They just weren't really paying me a full-time salary. But Philadelphia has this network of tech sites called Technically Media, and it started with Technically Philly. And their specialty, and they still exist, their specialty is covering kind of like underreported on tech markets. And I think these days, I think they're still in DC and Baltimore and Philadelphia. That's their whole network. But they tried to launch a Brooklyn outlet, and I was the first reporter there. And it was entirely, I was good friends with the founders, Chris Wink and Brian Kirk.
These are trade publications.
Yeah, it was basically a trade publication. So they asked me if I wanted to write for them. So I did. And I probably wrote my first crypto story technically there. There was this guy, Charlie Shrim, who eventually went to jail on, I don't know, somewhat ridiculous charges. But, well, I mean, the charges against him are a little silly, but I don't know. But he's fine.
I was just laughing because it's like you also obviously wrote this book about Sam Bankman-Fried. Like how many stories about like crypto people end with he eventually went to jail.
Right. Though Charlie didn't do anything nearly as bad as he more went to jail for probably like looking the other way a little bit more than he should have, that is really what he went to jail for. But he had an early crypto thing. It's probably the first thing I ever wrote about. I wasn't really paying a lot of attention as an idea of what Bitcoin was. People who cover crypto always ask each other, like, when was your first crypto story? So, like, I guess technically mine was like 2013, 2014, but I wasn't really doing it for a while later. And then at the Observer, I was always focused and I was a freelancer too. I was always interested in like whatever the weirdest stuff in tech was. So like the edgiest stuff, like robotics, I like that, cybernetics. And so I did some stuff on crypto. And then because of that, CoinDesk, which is the longest running crypto publication, they had kind of gone into a hole for a little bit, sort of barely survived for a while. We're kind of coming back out of it, started hiring again. And I was one of their early hires because their then editor had seen some of my coverage at the Observer. I seemed to kind of grasp the concepts, and he was like, would you want to come on board? And the Observer was not amazing to be at, it was sort of a rudderless semi place. So I was like, yeah, man, let's go. And it was a great raise in pay too. So that was great. And I've been full-time crypto ever since. So that was fall 2017, which was a boom era.
Bitcoin is kind of is the birth of crypto, basically, right?
100%.
When was that?
I think the first block of Bitcoin was in January 2009, I'm pretty sure.
At what point does it become clear to people on the inside, which I think in some sense you were, that this is like a going concern, right? Because new shit's starting all the time, in all sorts of, particularly in tech, right? New shit's starting all the time. Most of it doesn't amount to anything. Was it the case that the moment Bitcoin came into existence, people were like, holy shit, this is like ultimately going to change everything, or this is an important new technology? Or were a few years when it was kind of, could have gone either way. It wasn't obvious that it was going to become a big, or at least a big, small industry or something like that.
There were believers all along. I mean, there were true believers all along. The first boom was like 2013, I think. That was when Bitcoin hit $1,000 for the first time. And then right around then is when Ethereum launched. And Ethereum was really kind of the only, I think sort of still is true, is like the only other genuinely new idea that has come in crypto. And when Ethereum launched and it had its crisis with the DAO about 8 months later, I think, but didn't die, I think that's when this all kind of looked very real. And then not very long after that, the next boom happened, which was the 2017 boom. I'm a bit of a tech believer on some level, and just in that I have always tended to, like, when I see a new thing come along, if it doesn't disappear, I am early in saying it's not going to disappear. I was that guy who during the early days of social media was just like, love it or hate it, social media is going nowhere. And everyone's just like, I don't know about this. There was that whole period. It's like, yeah, it went nowhere. It didn't go away. because I graduated high school without an email. I remember stories on National Public Radio being
Yeah,
like,
how old are you? I think are we kind
we're
of in
similar
the
ages.
vicinity?
I just turned 48.
Okay, yeah. So I just turned 49. Okay,
Yeah.
right. So yes. I remember getting email, I think maybe my freshman or sophomore year of college, and and maybe whatever the browser was around then
Yeah.
too, so the internet as it, in some form that seems familiar, was right around when we were in college, I think.
Well, and then you would also remember people were endlessly skeptical of every one of these things.
Yeah.
I remember an era in which girls thought it was lame if a guy took her number in a cell phone, like, it's like, still, you should use a cocktail napkin. I remember that era.
I remember when online dating was a kind of weird, pervy thing that, you didn't want to admit to doing, right?
All this stuff. So it's just to me, if a new technology comes along and some nerds are excited and it doesn't die for a few years, my heuristic is it's not going to die, And so that was kind of my view on it. But I think it started to look really real around that 2017 boom. And then to me, by 2020, when there was DeFi summer, which was just people doing all these like financial experiments on Ethereum that the mainstream world didn't really pay attention to. It was the next year that the next boom happened with NFTs. But I was just like, real things are for sure happening. It's going to take a while, but this is a big thing.
I'm always fascinated by what's obvious to people who are inside the world, and then how long that can take to sort of percolate out. I mean, you had a sense, it sounds like by 2013 or something, that this was the real deal. Think about how many years there were when it was utterly clear to people, not even people who were like deep insiders, people who are just paying attention to this world, that this is really whatever you think of it, it's really interesting. It's going to be profoundly important. But it takes like a decade or something, or almost for that to sort of percolate out to the mainstream. And all of a sudden people are like, oh, what is this? What is this crypto thing? This is really significant.
You're giving me slightly too much credit. I would date my convinced moment actually to the Winklevoss brothers at South by Southwest in, I think, 2016. One of them said, Bitcoin just does make it cheaper to move large amounts of money around the world. Like moving large amounts of money around the world is pretty expensive. And you can do it much more cheaply with Bitcoin. And on the web, cheaper always wins eventually. And I was just like, that is true. From then on, I was pretty sold that this was going to go somewhere.
Without getting too technical, my understanding of Bitcoin, or basically just sort of crypto, is they came up with a technology that allowed for sort of electronic currency that was kind of self-verifying in a sense, right? It didn't have to pass through some mediating institution where the reason that like socially we trust it is because of its sort of its institutionality, its place in society, its embedding in sort of legal and social infrastructures, right? So like Bank of America could have issued an electronic currency and we would have trusted it because of all of these things, or the US government can issue currency and we trust it because of the history and all of the legal infrastructure. Is that a fair high-level characterization of what the innovation was? We just technically couldn't do it prior to that?
Yeah, right. There was no way to prove that I had something that nobody else had digitally until Bitcoin. And as Eric Voorhees, one of the people I quoted in some of the stories that I sent you, I was reading those, said when we talked, years ago when I was working on those things is, before Bitcoin, elevating trust just meant finding more trustworthy people. And Bitcoin allowed us to have trust without people in the loop.
And then what was the Ethereum innovation?
Well, the Ethereum innovation is so Bitcoin just allows you, in the simplest level, just allows you to move money around. It just allows you to say, I had these coins and now you have them and I don't have them anymore. That's all it really is there to do. Ethereum said, no, we can go much further than that. That's just computation. What you're doing is computation. We'll make a machine that can do any kind of computation. Like a transaction is a computation, fine, but we want to be able to do literally any kind of computation. So it's a Turing complete computer. Obviously you couldn't run graphics on it because it wouldn't be able to move fast enough. But and this goes to kind of the big point I wanted to make in our conversation, sort of what the grounding was. I think there are important philosophical ideas at the core of cryptocurrency. And in a lot of ways, the best cryptocurrencies are instantiations of philosophical ideas. And I think Ethereum is the easiest one to explain on this score. So Ethereum is a lot of things, and people in Ethereum believe a lot of things. But one thing that they believe, and particularly I think is a pretty shared idea, is that people should use the internet. The internet shouldn't use them. What's the thing you always hear about on the internet? If you're not paying for a product,
you're the product.
You're its product. Yeah. So on Ethereum, you pay for everything you want Ethereum to do, which can suck and can be kind of costly, but it is instantiating this world in which you are using it because you pay for every single transaction that it makes. That's a certain amount of bandwidth that takes on the Ethereum network, and you pay some money for it to do it. And that means you are really using this corner of the internet. It's not using you.
Bitcoin is just a sort of pass through for money, right? It's just another sort of translation of money into this other data stream that can then be sort of cashed out on the other end in money, right? What I understood from what you said about Ethereum is it's kind of taking that same technology that allows for this sort of self-verification, so you don't need this kind of mediating institution that's trusted, but then it's allowing all sorts of software calculations, constructions, and things like that. So all of a sudden, then you get into like all these sort of you can do all sorts of complicated contracts. You can build all sorts of complicated financial instruments, and probably other kinds of things too. That
you can do messaging. You can do social media.
Right. You can do whatever, but the underlying technology allows you to do it without these kind of institutions or these structures that had to exist in some sort of relationship to society and the legal infrastructure prior. Is that a fair kind of simplification of what? Okay. I mean, let's go to these founding ideas because some of these ideas were present. Isn't there like a Bitcoin manifesto or something that this anonymous dude created? I mean, some of this philosophy was present. It wasn't just some technologist who's like, oh, I figured out a way to do a cool thing and now I'll be able to make a lot of money on it. There were philosophical ideas there from the very beginning, right?
Bitcoin arises, I think, and I no one knows who Satoshi Nakamoto is, the guy who created Bitcoin. But are
you Satoshi Nakamoto?
No, I'm for sure not. I mean, that's what Satoshi would say, but I can't program a lick, so I just couldn't do any of it. But most people agree that he probably was a member of the cypherpunk community, which was this mailing list of nerds on the internet who could foresee the future that we're now in, that the internet's very cool, but it's going to spy on us like crazy. And they were trying to avoid that. They were trying to encourage people to use cryptography so they can use the internet and not have it constantly spying on them and all that kind of stuff. So, and then the big philosophical ideas Satoshi wanted to express, I mean, there's a lot of them, but I mean, he was mad about money itself, and he wanted to make a point about money itself. It's not an accident that Bitcoin launched during the Great Contraction or the Great Recession. He didn't like that Western governments were solving the problem by throwing new money at it. He didn't like the debasement of the currency. And so he wanted to invent a way to spend money on the internet that would have a fixed supply and that no one could change it. That was really the big idea that he had there. I mean, he also, other things are represented by Bitcoin, but there wasn't a huge gap. You mentioned the manifesto. It's called the white paper, the Bitcoin white paper. There wasn't an enormous gap between the white paper and it launching. I think the white paper was definitely launched and came out on Halloween. And I think that was 2008. I'm pretty sure it was only 3 months later that he actually launched it with the Genesis block. But yeah, he put out this white paper that lots of people have read. It's pretty readable. There's parts of it that get a little confusing in the middle. And then the first block of Bitcoin, famously, with every block of Bitcoin, if you're a miner, you can put a message in the block if you want to. A lot of people don't, but you can. And the famous first message was just what was on the cover of the Times of London that day. But it was like Chancellor of the Exchequer on the brink of second bailout for banks. And that he could have chosen a lot of headlines, and he chose, no one thinks it's an accident. He chose that one,
So he didn't like money. So it's coming from a basically libertarian perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my sort of relatively simplistic understanding of currencies and money supplies and how we print money and how we deal at the sort of macroeconomic level with fluctuations in the economy is, I mean, it's complicated. It doesn't always make like intuitive sense, but it's a fairly organic development in response to just the complexities of our globalized economy and modern states. And before we had central banks and these sort of standard arsenal of macroeconomic interventions in the economy, what sort of capitalistic societies looked like, or maybe non-capitalistic society, was just these horrific sort of boom-bust cycles. I mean, that's a kind of standard sort of liberal, maybe neoliberal story. So we developed all these techniques for, minimizing the effects of these cycles, diminishing the severity of depressions, buffering against the risk of hyperinflation and excessive inflation and all sorts of things. Like, what's the argument against that from Satoshi Nakamoto and cypherpunks and things like that? These are all just systems of control? Play it out for me.
I think the thing that they were frustrated about, and I think the thing that they were really afraid of, which it was a little surprising how it didn't work out, but the core idea is property. They want you to know what you have and what your property is. And so, there's a big meme in the Bitcoin world that 1 Bitcoin is equal to 1 Bitcoin. You know what Bitcoin is relative to Bitcoin, whereas, your dollar, what does your dollar mean? It's changing all the time.
Right.
You're right. I mean, you're not wrong that we have managed to like really lower the level of volatility in the economy. But it also, I think, as they watched all the money printing happening in 2008, and I confess I was kind of in the same place too, it was extremely surprising to me how long it took for real inflation to kick in, you know? And I think they thought it was going to come a lot faster. And so people who were into Bitcoin were like, let's move into Bitcoin fast because with all this money printing, because remember, we were in zero interest rates. Like we were effectively printing money from 2008 until 2021, and when we accelerated it in the pandemic. It's not like we hadn't been doing it. The printer was still on 12 years later. And it blew my mind that whole time too, that like inflation hadn't finally kicked off. And then it did finally kick off when we imprinted a ton more in the pandemic. I guess that just speaks to the power of the US economy and stuff like that. But that was the big takeaway. And I guess, and also to zoom out even more, another thing about this world, so going back even further, another idea a lot of this is based on is this book that came out in the late 90s called The Sovereign Individual. And in The Sovereign Individual, they foresaw the internet really taking off, and they believed in a future that a big theme in cryptocurrency and a lot of these early ideas is the option of exit. So giving people a way to get out of a system that they don't like and into a system that they do, that they're more comfortable with. And you can't change the chunk of land you sit on, but maybe you can change the means by which you transact. And this was something that the sovereign individual guys wrote about back in the day. They envisioned this future in which states will be fluid. They won't be associated with land anymore. And a part of how you'll associate with a state is by choosing its money, which that sounds, I don't know if that world will really ever come, but like we are now in a world in which you have kind of at least a few monetary regimes that you can opt into, and crypto has made that. So I think that's what the cypherpunks were saying. It's just like you should have some choice. You shouldn't live subjected to one gigantic monetary regime. And to be clear, I'm not advocating for it. I'm just saying this is the way of thinking these guys were coming at these things with.
What is the world they envision? So there's some piece of it that's just a little bit of protection or insulation, or maybe a lot of protection and insulation from what seem to them arbitrary decisions of the particular state in which they happen to live. You're saying that the vision was really more radical than that, which was you could exist in an economy that was fundamentally separate from the sort of, geographic nation state in which you lived, right? Doesn't some of this come out of or there's an influence of two separate Neil Stephenson novels? It's like Diamond Age and what's the other one?
The Cryptonomicon?
Cryptonomicon, right.
I've only read Cryptonomicon. I haven't read the Diamond Age. But yeah, the Cryptonomicon, I think, speaks to some of these things. I mean, we're kind of seeing some of these worlds start to develop in, honestly, video games. There are some of these crypto-based video games that have money in them, and that people are starting to build additional companies on top of those video games. So, because it's funny, this is one of Vitalik Buterin's big radicalizing moments. He was playing some video game. I think it was EverQuest. He was really into it, and he had some wizard who had a spell that he thought was great, but then they nerfed the spell. And it showed him the kind of the dangers of centralized control, that if someone, finds edge out there, if there's a central power, they can always take it away. So in some of these crypto video games, that you own your assets, and you obviously play the games the company makes, but you can also make other stuff, or you can do financial engineering around those assets and things like that. So people are starting to form economies around some of these games. So we're starting to see that happen. So yeah, there's ways in which there are little separate economies forming in a really nascent way. And I guess and another big idea here, another core idea of Bitcoin, and a thing that, Satoshi was definitely right about, is Satoshi could see that there were more and more ways that it wasn't just that the financial powers that be were futzing with the money supply in a way that was in their interest, to sort of encourage certain kinds of activities over time. But there was also more and more ways in which you were being restricted on who you could transact with. You didn't have those freedoms. And this big idea this sort of took off in
demonetizing porn sites, demonetizing if somebody's, politically unsavory, if they're identified as politically unsavory, the whole, debanking?
Operation Choke Point. Yeah, which was particularly on the Obama administration against guns and against payday lenders, which, I have objections to both, but still.
Right, but that sort of arbitrary decision to make it harder for them to sort of function. They're legal, but suddenly it becomes harder to function in the sort of normal economy, yeah.
And this powerful idea came out. I don't think anyone said this until around 2020, but somebody, I think it was this Twitter guy who was a CryptoPunk holder, was the first to say it, but he pointed out this big thread that all rights are downstream from the to transact. So you can say you have the freedom of speech, and that's a nice idea. But if you can't buy a sign, if you can't pay for a website, you don't really have freedom of speech. Like, if you can't go to a protest if you can't buy a train ticket, but no one ever talked about saying freedom of transactions is a fundamental right until the internet came along, because you couldn't really stop someone from spending cash. But as the world becomes more and more digitized, now you've got to protect your right to transact. And honestly, there's all kinds of restrictions on how we transact with normal money. But Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies do provide a way to route around it. So that's another core idea that's being expressed by these technologies.
Talk a little bit about Sam Bankman-Fried. He was often talked a lot about in the context of effective altruism. And I don't know if what is the relationship between that and crypto? Or was it more just that those were two things? There were sort of overlapping communities. This is all sort of tech world ideas that have currency in that space. Or was there a more sort of foundational connection between crypto and effective altruism?
No. What I love about the Sam story, so I wrote a book about Sam Bankman-Fried that like 4 people read.
Yeah, welcome to the club of writing books that 4 people read. Yeah.
Yeah. But what I found interesting about the Sam story is, like, obviously I've always been interested in people who are driven by ideas. And what was neat about Sam to me on some level is he was the first person I saw in crypto who was very driven by a set of ideas. They just weren't the crypto ideas. He didn't care about this industry at all. Like in my book, I report that he says his favorite cryptocurrency is Tether, which is a very important, very useful cryptocurrency, but it doesn't really have a core idea to it. It's just a stable coin. And it's because he was just here to pirate off of a bunch of rich people who were not being careful enough about their trading, and he could exploit it. Like that's what brought Sam. But I love ideas and I love ideology. But if I have a big idea, it's that I'm a Camus guy. I think going too deeply into any given idea just makes people into idiots. And I have this thing I like to say is that, like, there's a lot of people out there who are so smart they're stupid. And I think Sam is a great example of being so smart he was stupid. Like, he was able to talk himself into a lot of really stupid moves. And those were very much driven by the ideas of effective altruism and the ideas of utilitarianism, not crypto ideas. And believe me, you can be so smart you're stupid in crypto too, for sure. But that is not the category of stupid Sam was. Sam was this category of stupid that's driven by this thinking that, like, probability is everything. People think about risk all wrong. That's what made Sam into a moron and what made him into a criminal.
Well, so I mean, actually, this is an interesting question about the kind of the social, like, who are these people in a sort of social characterological sense. Let me just put my cards on the table. I mean, I think of them as a bunch of like standard issue STEM, somewhere on the autism spectrum nerds, very good at doing certain kinds of analysis, but are, often somewhat at a deficit in terms of understanding not just sort of social or like interpersonal relationships in the way that we talk about, people on the spectrum can't sort of imagine the kind of read body language or social cues in the same way, or don't have as good a sense of how other people are thinking. But also, I think I've often thought downstream of that is a real kind of naivete about politics and a preference for sort of simplified systems of understanding the world. That's how I think of this world.
Do you mean effective altruism or crypto? Which one are you talking about?
All the above.
Okay, all right.
That's my sort of vulgar picture of this world. And I'm asking because you actually know a lot of these people and have interacted with them. Is that a fair characterization, or am I sort of mischaracterizing them based on my prejudices about certain groups of people?
Well, there's all kinds of people in crypto, right? There's tons of scammers and hustlers. And there's also tons of just like dreamers who just see a shot at making a bunch of money or like instantiating some silly set of ideas that they have. There's tons of those people, sure. But there's some really sophisticated and really smart people. And I would push back on your idea of this political lack of sophistication. A good example, I think, is what Ethereum is doing with regard to finance, right? A criticism you'll often hear of the idea of decentralized finance is that they're just reinventing the banking system. They're recreating all the products that you already see in banking on a blockchain. Why does it matter? Well, it matters for a really important reason. Because if you understand how 2008 happened, if you understand how the Great Contraction happened, you know that it's because a ton of people knew there was a shitload of risk in the system, but they didn't really understand how deep the risk went and how far it went or what it looked like. They were all naive. They were all blind to how far all the bets people were taking were.
Well, right, because it started with these basically mortgages that were given to people who really should not have been given mortgages. And then
I was working on that at Acorn at the time. I was like, this is why are you getting these loans?
And then they transformed this sort of obvious risk at that level, at the kind of retail level, through all these financial instruments until it became more and more vague what was actually happening.
And then there was these giant insurance policies on those. So there was this CDSs, which were the first thing you're talking about, and the CDOs with these giant insurance policies on them. Yeah, so everyone had this vague idea that all those were out there, but you couldn't. It's not like you could like open up a spreadsheet and see them all somewhere.
No, and in fact, these big multinational corporations who you'd think would be hip to these things were offering up insurance on what turned out to be junk securities, right?
Yeah.
Because they didn't see it. They themselves didn't perceive it.
And so the way decentralized finance is different. It's like, yes, they are recreating all of these products on the blockchain for sure. The difference is they are doing it all out in the open all the time. Everyone can see all the risk that's out there. It's just, if you're doing it in DeFi, it's on a public ledger. People may not know who you are. You're just a string of numbers, but they can see your relationship to other things. They can see the kind of bets you've taken. And a critical point to make about how this all actually does work in a real way is when the big crypto crunch happened after 2021 crested, especially during the fall of FTX. There were all these crypto lenders out there. There are two kinds of crypto lenders out there. There were centralized companies that would like let you post some Bitcoin and borrow some money against it. And there were DeFi companies, which weren't even really companies. They're like DeFi protocols.
DeFi is decentralized finance. Is that what DeFi?
Yeah, decentralized finance, DeFi, yeah. There were these decentralized protocols that would lend you money. Basically, all the centralized crypto lenders, with the exception of like one or two like really well-behaved ones, went bankrupt and went belly up, because people didn't know how much risk they had. There was a lot of unexposed stuff. They all went bad. None of the DeFi lenders, they all had there was all a bunch of loans recalled. There was all a bunch of loans closed out. A lot of people lost money on those loans, but they were never under collateralized. They didn't break because it was all out there in the open the whole time. No one was you couldn't take on stupid bets. So DeFi worked fine. DeFi, a lot of people lost money, but it was still in an orderly, predictable way as the system was meant to work.
What obviously comes to mind is, well, the counterexample would be the one that you know an enormous amount about, which is the Sam Bankman-Fried case. Why is that not a counterexample to the idea that, things can't happen in the shadows with crypto?
Everything in Sam's portfolio was in the shadows. It was a centralized company that took a bunch of people's digital assets. You can make centralized companies off of cryptocurrencies. Every exchange is that. Every, normal standard exchange, it's not a centralized exchange, is that. And they're all black boxes. And so Sam is exactly what Satoshi was warning people about all along. And we've seen this again and again with exchanges. Sam's is hardly the first exchange that blew up. It's just the worst case, So yeah, no, Sam proves the point. He doesn't undermine the point. He just happened to do it with crypto assets.
One scenario is, and this is what's happened with a lot of innovations in the tech space that have begun in a sort of decentralized, small d democratic sense, is they ultimately get incorporated into more sort of traditional structures and then that sort of recapitulate the same pathologies, although often they get incorporated into those structures because they're also recapitulate the same benefits of existing structures. Is one scenario that basically what we see in 5 to 10 or 20 years is that most of these, there's certain efficiencies that it provides that get incorporated into existing infrastructures. And precisely the thing that you're saying that's kind of a benefit that might be a hedge against those kinds of periodic crises where all these shifty things are happening, but they're not transparent to people. It doesn't function that way because most of the crypto-based economy is just incorporated into our standard economy.
Probably. I'll give you a couple of scenarios. I used to have this take about the way the internet has gone over the last few years. Just everything is kind of devolving to platforms, and that sucks. And platforms are bad by and large. But you can always publish a website. I can always start, Brady'sDumbThoughts.com. And I used to really believe that, and that is true. I can start Brady'sDumbThoughts.com, but it is more and more true that option is less relevant every day. No one will see it, So I worry about that with crypto. I think, yes, it will largely be co-opted. Yes, the suits will take over control over almost all of it. But Bitcoin will always be there, and there will always be a way to get into pure direct Bitcoin. And that will always, and other digital assets too, that do similar things. There's a bunch of them like Monero and whatever, Zcash, there are a lot of good ones. There is always that opportunity to work around the existing money system that will be there. So I'd like to believe that will be there for
then,
people.
To your point, on the one hand, sure. And I'm just sort of arguing against where I was a second ago. Like on the one hand, sure, the suits take over. But to say that as if nothing changes is to say, well, I guess the internet and social media didn't change anything, right? Like they can have profoundly transformative effects for good and ill, even if ultimately in some sort of economic sense or platform sense they get assimilated. It doesn't mean they didn't change everything, right? So the question about Bitcoin would be, even if the answer to my question was yes, it will get taken over by the suits in some sense, it could still be profoundly transformative, right? Just not necessarily in the utopian sense that these people imagined it would.
I do think that crypto will ultimately make moving money around the world a lot cheaper, and that will save us all a bunch of money. Whether the suits capture all that or we do, that's ask any question. So I think that will help in that way. Another take though that could be, this is I would put it like this, a 3% on this one, but it is true that the US dollar dominates the world and the US is increasingly using that to its advantage in more and more ways, which is driving more and more countries away from the dollar. And when I say this, people say I'm nuts and I sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist, but I just do think there's a chance that this works out. If you look at the category of countries that are getting frustrated, they do tend to be kind of the wackier countries. It's hard to imagine them agreeing on building a separate economy around any one of their currencies. And so one can imagine a way, and these are some of the worst countries in the world, but even still, the obvious other choice for them is Bitcoin. They could build a common economy on Bitcoin. And if that happens, yes, it sucks that a bunch of bad companies are using this platform, but that makes that platform very real and available to everyone forever. That means that it is a powerful source that is always an opportunity for exit for anyone who feels oppressed by their current society, So I think Bitcoin will be here till the heat death of the universe. And I can't imagine a scenario in which it becomes a crucial part of the global economy, at least the Pepsi to the dollar's Coke.
What I have a hard time conceptualizing, but in some respects is kind of the most interesting or important question is let's say that happens. There's a version of that where that happens. And in a sense, it's it has major global implications, but there's a version of that that's whatever, let's just call it the euro or something like that. It's another currency that plays a big role, that changes the balance of power, but it doesn't necessarily change the way people live. That's, to me, is the more profound but harder question to wrap my mind around.
Well, it changes the way they live and that allows them to freely associate with no one watching and no one in control. It is free currency with no one watching.
But it's not going to be, if China ends up being part of kind of establishing the global crypto counterbalance to the dollar, it's hard to believe that would, China's not going to do that in a fashion because you can.
Oh, China's not going to have Bitcoin on the streets. They're not going to do that.
So who are you talking about? Maybe I should. What do you mean wacko country? You talking about North Korea and
all the countries who are resistant to the dollar. But Bitcoin wouldn't be in this scenario I'm describing. I can't imagine it becomes the day-to-day currency in any of these places, but it becomes the way they all transact with each other. It becomes the way they do global trade. It becomes the way they do trade.
It's like a dark web, but on steroids.
Yeah.
What we're talking about is just this sort of libertarian paradise dystopia or something like that.
Well, I think that the nations themselves internally would look much like they still look like now, but Bitcoin would be their alternative way to transact with each other. It would become this place for global finance and for trade finance. But once that happens, once a bunch of nations are using it at that macro level, that means it's going to be available to everyone, everywhere, forever. But you won't be buying hot dogs with Bitcoins, but you might be buying 4 tons of lumber with Bitcoin. That's where I see a possible way that Bitcoin becomes an ongoing, or some other cryptocurrency, but Bitcoin seems the most likely.
I'm trying to think about what does that look like? Or maybe what does it look like already in the US? You living in Kansas or Texas, Philadelphia or something like that, and the Bitcoin economy or whatever the cryptocurrency world is much larger and more stable in a certain sense than it is right now. So it ceases to be such a kind of niche phenomenon. It still is a relatively niche hobby, niche phenomenon in the United States, right? Most Americans are not transacting a lot via cryptocurrency. How does that change what our lives are like subjectively?
If nothing changes here too much, I don't think Americans are going to need it very much anytime soon. We did see Canadians need it recently when the Canadian trucker protests happened and Justin Trudeau decided to shut off the ways of donating money to them. people started using Bitcoin to get money to them because that was a way to do it. I don't even know what the Canadian trucker protest was about, really. I don't know. It was a demonstration of the power of censorship resistance. And it was a demonstration that, freedom of speech, which they don't really have in Canada, but whatever, the idea of expression is downstream from the freedom to transact. So we saw it there. The places where people need Bitcoin and things like it right now are in other parts of the world where they have, where our inflation is nothing, where they have like rapidly accelerating inflation. And what those folks are turning to, honestly, is less Bitcoin. I mean, some to a degree, but they're turning to stablecoins. And that is really happening. There's been good research on this, that people who are earning some money and are building up some wealth, but can't hold on to their wealth because keeping it in their local currency just causes it to go away rapidly, are buying stablecoins.
Stable coins are just tethered to the value of like the US dollar or something. Is that what's a stable coin?
Yeah. A stable coin is just a token that represents a dollar sitting somewhere, or more often actually US treasuries. The biggest company in the world that does it is this company called Tether.
And it's just backed by US dollars? Like they just have a reserve of US dollars and
they have piles of treasuries mostly. And Tether has like a little bit of Bitcoin and a few other things too. I mean, they've got, billions and billions of dollars, but
they're taking, existing fiat currency.
Mm-hmm. It's all dollars.
It's all US dollars. They're just issuing a token that's backed 1-to-1 by US dollars. So it's not even like a US bank where they don't even actually have to have I don't know what the percent reserve, like they don't have to have 100% of the dollars that they're loaning out, right?
Well, no, they do. That's really the difference is they do have 100%. They have more than 100%.
Right, I'm saying
usually.
A US bank doesn't have to have 100%.
Yeah, they have like 3%. Yeah.
But Tether has to have 100%.
100%.
So it's utterly, as long as the US dollar is secure, it's utterly secure in that sense. Okay. But it's just outside of the normal, because there are national currencies that are tethered to the dollar, but it's outside of the sort of vicissitudes of whatever's happening in that country and its economy and its central bank's policies and things like that.
Yeah. And Tether in 2022, when everything was falling apart in crypto, had just insane drawdowns. Like I think like 25% of their total supply people redeemed and got out. And they met all those, they said they had it and it looks like they really do, and now they're totally 100% and more back. And so, so these people around the world who they're using crypto to exit their existing regimes, they're getting dollars, they're earning yield on those dollars. There's ways that they can get access to like treasury-like yields. So they're making some money. They're able to transact with people with them that feels more reliable. So it is really providing a means of transacting better in places where transactions don't work very well. They work great here. So you probably don't need them much on a day-to-day basis in the US. But the other thing that we're starting to see, and this is going to take a while to fully get there, big companies and even modest-sized companies that are international have to move a lot of money around the world all the time. And the way we move money around the world is creaky and slow. So like you might move $50 million from the US to, say, France. And that might take 3 days where your money is just kind of in limbo. And that means 3 days that you're not earning yield on it. And like $50 million of not getting yield for 3 days is real money. Well, with stablecoins, you can move it basically in 10 minutes and like know it's really there. And there's a lot of other complications that need to be worked out before that really is working. There's a lot of liquidity needs to get in the system that's not there yet, blah, blah, blah. But people can see it. Like they see the path to that. And so that's going to start meaning real savings for a bunch of companies out there that will matter somehow. Again, is that revolutionary? I don't know.
Is there an ideology around crypto anymore? Or is it all just like, it's just ways of making money or moving money?
Well, crypto was never monolithic. I mean, that's an important thing. Like Bitcoiners are very different from Ethereum people, for example.
Yeah, but where are the utopian dreams these days when it comes to crypto?
I'd say the Ethereums have a utopia of you are in control of your data, you are in control of your money, everything's out in the open, it's harder for you to get screwed. That's sort of the Ethereum utopia dream. The Bitcoin utopian dream is a little bit more hard-edged. It's like, you can't take my stuff from me. You can't seize my property, screw you, the man. And I think the place where they all agree on, and I think the Trojan horse, if there's one thing the whole crypto world does agree on, and I think the Trojan horse that it's building up, that it's going to make the powers that be's lives a little bit harder going forward, is I just do think once these boring businessy things have fully been locked into the global economy and people are using stablecoins all the time, they're going to build all kinds of ring fencing around all this stuff to make most of the day-to-day use of it. You will need to know who the people are. There'll be all these identity checks and things like that. But even still, if you want to make a transaction you don't want people to know about, by the time that all happens, if you want true censorship resistance, if you want to be able to hide what you're doing for some reason, you're going to be able to do it. And some people think that's bad and some people think that's good. But I think that that is going to be the change that will exist for a very long time once crypto is really embodied in the world, is you will have a private way to transact with another person if otherwise transactions have been denied you. And that does seem like a powerful idea. And yeah, criminals are going to use it, for sure. But so will dissidents and protesters and people who just are doing things the world's not ready for yet that they want to restrict. It'll be useful for a lot of people at times. And it'll always be marginal, but still, I think some people will be glad that that's there. And I think that's one thing the whole crypto world agrees on, is that like getting censorship resistance in place for the whole world would be a net good.
Well, I think that would be a net good too. I mean, I was going to say, maybe you don't want to answer this. I mean, you're a reporter for Axios. I was going to say, like, are you pro-crypto or anti-crypto? I think where I am at the moment, and again, granting that my technical knowledge of these things is pretty shallow, is I think I'm anti in this sense. I'm looking just at the domestic political scene, right? All the crypto money in the last election went towards supporting Donald Trump. I mean, huge amounts of crypto money, because the Biden administration was very hard on crypto, cracked down a lot of stuff, filed a lot of lawsuits. Basically, I think perceived it as a threat to the kind of stability of the American financial system, right? Looked at what happened with Sam Bankman-Fried, but also just looked at like the enormous number of kind of opportunists and scammers and fraudsters and just hustlers in this space, and the fundamental instability of meme coins and things like that, and saw it as a potentially really destabilizing force in the American economy, like a thing that could bring about the next Great Recession or Great Depression. And so they wanted to assert as much state control over it as they realistically could. And I looked at that equation and said, yeah, that makes sense. Like, I'm not saying their response was optimal, but versus what seems to be the Trump response, and certainly the desire of, I think, the organizations that were funding Trump and Trump-associated politicians, I'm going to go with the Biden approach, right? Over the just like, let's Wild West it and hope for the best. Is mine a reasonable perspective? What am I missing in that equation?
I've been pretty clear that I'm broadly pro-crypto. I mean, and kind of from the stance what I said at the very beginning, it's not going anywhere. Everyone needs to quit pretending it's going, it's come too far. So you might as well just deal with it. At this point, I just feel like the Biden administration's approach was just such a self-own. People use this Wild West phrase about crypto all the time. And a narrative about Donald Trump, I'm not defending Trump. I'm not saying I'm a fan of the guy, but a narrative about him is he's deregulating crypto. And I'm like, deregulate it from what? And never has a single rule been written from the federal government about cryptocurrency, except for like, I guess, one tax guidance from the IRS. That's like all that's really been written. Like, the Biden administration could have just written a set of rules, which Coinbase literally sued them to do. They were like, would you please write some rules for our industry? We don't even care what they are. Just write ones that reflect the way this technology works. So like the so-called Wild West black hat criminals of the crypto world are saying, please write laws for us. And that is what the Trump administration is doing. So you can, that isn't deregulation. I mean, I'm just speaking factually here. That is actually regulating,
Are the rules that the Trump administration is in the process of writing or is likely to write, in your estimation, are they going to result in a sort of infrastructure for crypto where that fear that I was articulating, that kind of the destabilizing threat, that was the thing I was worried about. Like, we look at when we were talking earlier about the housing, these mortgages that were given out, and it was kind of, there were regulations around finance, but they were sort of manipulated in such a way that it ultimately destabilized our society, caused a recession, threatened to cause a depression. Can we trust that the Trump administration is regulating crypto in a way that will minimize that risk, or do a decent job of minimizing that risk?
The way that we have historically regulated financial products in the United States is simply with a disclosure-based regime. And so what we've said is, if you're going to put a financial product out there, there's a number of questions that we have about it that you need to answer, that the public needs to know the answer to. So they need to understand, are you creating a meme coin that has nothing behind it? Or is your asset actually attempting to have some idea and some product behind it? Is there some roadmap towards the future? And so I can't really answer your question, like, will crypto be further destabilizing? But I do think the ideas that are being floated right now for a regulatory regime would give people a place where they could go and be like, what is this thing that I'm thinking about buying? in some kind of standardized way. And we don't have that now. That doesn't exist today. And that doesn't sound like a bad idea to me. I don't think Americans are going to ever be that psyched about a government that just wants to wrap everything in Nerf material to protect you from every risk in the world. There is a hunger for risk in this country, and that's one of the reasons why we're by far the strongest and most dynamic economy on earth. Will there be risk? Yeah, I think there'll be risk, but I do think crypto brings a lot more openness to the economy, and so there'll be a lot more transparency in these products. I just think the Biden administration and the Democrats just could have dealt with this on their own time in a real way. And the fact that this giant ocean of crypto money came at them was so foreseeable and is so entirely their own fault. It's just like, if you don't like Trump, it's a bummer that's the way you feel. But it's just like, they could have avoided all of this, and they could have probably written a stricter set of rules than what we're going to get, which, I guess certain people would have liked, but they just opted not to write rules at all. They thought there was some way that they could kill this thing that had become a behemoth at this point. Like, there was no killing it.
That's persuasive, in as far as I can kind of evaluate it. I don't see any particularly compelling utopian, libertarian, freedom providing hopes around crypto anymore. It sounds like a kind of set of financial instruments that may increase efficiency, that will enable sort of risk that some people want. Maybe there's a net benefit in freedom in terms of you can do things with your money that you couldn't do before. But in terms of like altering the sort of structure of society in a way that meaningfully expands the domain in freedom in a kind of democratic sense, I guess I'm not seeing a lot there. I can see it in like some country because it's authoritarian or because it's just such a weak state that there's kind of instability. But in the United States, like I'm not feeling it from what you're saying. And I don't think that's a knock against crypto in a sense any more than we don't expect all sorts of sectors to expand the sort of space for freedom, right? Like,
you and I are old enough to understand that everything that seems exciting early on ends up a giant disappointment,
Well, I know. That's what I'm saying. Like,
yeah.
like which is not, in a sense, a knock on crypto. It's a knock on the sort of utopian hopes for crypto. Where do you come in on that?
Oh, I'm expecting to be wildly disappointed. I'm expecting to hate my beat so much soon.
I can imagine the risk for you is it just converts into just like, I'm a financial reporter, essentially.
Yeah. Totally.
I'm a business reporter.
The hot blockchain now, you probably haven't heard of this one, but kind of the other hot blockchain these days is this one called Solana. Solana's big idea is like, what if these things went faster? I mean, that's really their big deep thought, let's go a lot faster. I think it's going to be nice to have these things in the world for, some edge cases and stuff. And I think it could end up being more important than we all realized eventually. But I think having watched the internet do what it did and the stunning, wild disappointment everything about it became, I think, it'll probably be much the same in crypto,
So we're disappointed in crypto, though we're sort of, mildly benevolent towards it. Where's the new action? Because there always is out in Silicon Valley world.
The boring answer is, if you've been covering crypto since 2017, as I have, there's been this endless conversation about which cryptocurrencies are and aren't securities in this really irritating Supreme Court case called the Howey test. And the thing I am wildly excited about is if this year goes the way most people think it will, I'll never have to talk about the Howey test again. And I just can't wait for that day. I'm so sick.
You mean the court is going to rule in some way that clarifies?
The Congress will write a new law that will say this is this and that's that. The problem has been, for 30 years, it's all been based off of one court case, which causes all this need for interpretation and blah, blah, blah. And is it or isn't it? Ugh, it's just endless. I'm so sick of it. I just can't wait for that to be over. So I'm excited about that, but it's not very exciting. The thing that I would say right now, which I'm the most intrigued by is, and we don't see a lot of this yet, but a lot of people are working to merge AI and blockchains and to kind of break AI out of its centralized chambers of control, which I don't know. I think that's could be good. AI does seem like a very powerful potential means of control. And if all the big AIs are totally centralized, that's disconcerting to me. And further out, another thing I'm psyched about is people complain about Bitcoin's environmental impact a lot. I was a former professional greenie, as I told you. I actually don't really worry about that very much. I think it's kind of a wrong-headed way of thinking. One of the things crypto is very good at is decentralizing resources and helping people coordinate decentralized resources. And if you understand the problems we have with the American grid, and I do, you know that one of the big problems we have is an excess of centralization, and we need to bring new points of power online, and that will enable us to be a lot greener, a lot more renewable. And I suspect that cryptocurrencies will actually be really helpful in sort of navigating all of that. It's a complex dance. You can't just bring sources online. It's a complex dance that has to be managed. And that's what crypto networks are good at, helping to coordinate complex dances in a decentralized way.
So it wouldn't actually be currency that you're talking about. You're saying it's the technology that enables the currency that would enable, more efficient, decentralized power networks or something?
Well, it probably would be the money itself. I mean, it probably would be money. It would be the money would be a way in which, you would say you turn on, you turn off, you get access to this power line, you don't. It's like that probably would be done with price signals, and cryptocurrencies are good at doing that kind of thing on the fly in real time. So I actually think, I think it would be money. It's like money is the best way to coordinate complex, who wants to get on this wire more, because we can't all be on it.
Brady, your younger left-wing self would be so disheartened to hear you.
Yeah, this is a way I always.
You sound like a Hayekian or something like that. It's just there is no other way to organize complex systems but through markets or something. Yeah,
I kind of thought that then too. I was never 100% with my fellow travelers. I was a little outcast on that score.
What do you want to say about Substack?
Well, so Substack to me, I've been listening to you talk, and I know you're feeling really great about how Substack is, and I like it too. But it kind of comes back to my concern about Substack, and I don't know what the alternative is, but I just feel like there's all these people who are doing kind of well on there, who are psyched about it and feel like it's this different chunk of the internet, and it's just I've been on the internet long enough, it's going to end up awful like everything else, And it's a platform. It's going to have its own interests. It's going to start nudging us in certain directions. It's going to start taking on a certain character.
And shitification, right? Isn't that the technical term? Yes,
it's coming.
Right.
Yeah, and shitification is coming to Substack. And it's just I probably will launch a newsletter eventually too. But it's just I kept relaunching blogs and stuff on the open internet, just thinking there was some way that you could just have our own chunk of land. And it's not working. But all these people who I see excited right now, especially older folks like you, it's just how can you not see that this is going to end up in the same places everything else has ended up?
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I actually have been I think I've tried to be pretty careful, although I understand how I can be grouped in with that, of not co-signing on the more sort of utopian visions for what Substack is. I think when I say what's exciting to me about it, and I think the comparison I've drawn before, which is instructive, is to sort of the golden age of the blogosphere, right? It was a period of time when there was this sort of expansion and opening up of journalism and sort of critique of the mainstream, and a lot of new voices came in, and a lot of new kinds of conversations happened that at least hadn't been happening in the mainstream journalistic institutions as they'd existed at that point. It was exciting as somebody who is frustrated with how things were and these sort of narrow grooves that so much of particularly opinion journalism fell into. And then all of a sudden there's this explosion and all these smart people are coming from all these different places and having these interesting conversations and these new forms are taking shape. And then what you said, and then it happened. Then all the people, then Matthew Iglesias and Ezra Klein and Andrew Sullivan and all of they all got hired by the mainstream. So they all got institutionalized, right? And then the blogosphere in that form ceased to exist. I'm not assuming that won't happen with Substack. I'm mostly excited in just a very selfish sense, which is it feels to me like Substack now is the golden age of the blogosphere, whenever that was, late 90s, early 2000s, and it's a fun space to be in.
For now, yeah. And you're enjoying now. You're I'll be here until the party ends.
Now, and I'm enjoying now, and I think in probably almost exactly the same way that people who were active in that blogosphere were enjoying that then. I will not at all be surprised if what you say is going to happen happens. I don't know where this is going to end up, but yeah. So I'm not sure we disagree. Do you disagree with that characterization of it? That
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's fun right now. It's a cool place. I just do think it's going to go off the rails. It bums me out seeing the Substack founders being oh, let's get new people in all the time and let's add video and all this stuff. It's just and that's what happens when you're a venture-backed company. You've got to do that, but it just leads to the terrible days come eventually.
Well, Brady, anything big you're working on right now? Last question.
There's a new crypto magazine coming out called Use Case from some friends of mine who used to be at CoinDesk back in the day and now have their own business. And I'm going to have a big feature on that on the history of stablecoins. I think it's fun. It sounds boring, but I think it's a fun story. I think I wrote it in a fun way. I just turned that in. So that'll come out sometime this fall. It'll be on print. Sounds like they're going to make it all look very pretty. So people should look at usecase.xyz and pick up a copy, I guess. That's probably my next big thing. And then, I write the Axios crypto newsletter that comes out twice a week. If people thought I didn't sound too crazy, they should subscribe to that. It's free. I'll tell you about crypto policy developments.
Brady, it's been a pleasure. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is an area where I've been interested, but I've been sort of wary of kind of dipping in because I don't know that much about it. But having on somebody like you allowed me to do so in relatively good conscience.
Great. Peace, man.
This has been another episode of Eminent Americans. Big thanks to my editor, producer extraordinaire, Robert Scaramuccia. Big thanks as well to Alec Owensworth of Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah for letting us use his music for our intro and outro. If you liked what you heard, and I imagine you did, if you've made it this deep into the episode, then please rate us on whatever the relevant podcasting platform is. And if you have any questions or comments, email me at djops@gmail.com. That's djopps@gmail.com. I promise to respond at least until the faraway and probably mythical day when I have such a vast audience that I can't in good conscience respond to all the emails while still upholding my responsibility to my loved ones. Have a great day.